Good morning and welcome to Birding Basics. My name is Carolyn Knight. I run the education and outreach programs for the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, and today on Birding Basics we are talking about the Hirundinidae family. So these are the swallows, and in case it wasn't totally clear at this point, I'm not running through these families in any sort of taxonomic order for the main reason that if I were, we would be talking about like loons this week, and frankly we only get a couple here in Santa Clara County in the middle of winter, so it doesn't really make much sense to spend a week in the summertime talking about them. However, this is prime time to talk about the swallows, in large part because this is their breeding season and this is where they breed. There are species of swallows all throughout the world. There's more than 80 species. They're found on all of the continents. They're pretty much everywhere. We have 8 species that are reliably found in North America, 6 of which actually breed here in Santa Clara County. So let's take a closer look at some of the species that we can see when you're just out and about in Santa Clara County. One of these is the tree swallow. So these have a really great blue-green iridescence and a bright white breast and throat. They're very distinctive. Like all of the swallows, they are zippy little dudes. You're very seldom going to actually get them to sit still, like it's doing in this picture. So one of the key things to pay attention to for swallows is just trying to get them in your binoculars while they're flying in air. They're very acrobatic because they hunt on the wing, flying insects in a hunting style, or a foraging style rather, known as hawking. They're very fast, they don't like to sit still for you, so they can be a challenge to ID. Another one of our common species that we'll see here is our barn swallow. Now these guys are particularly distinctive with their long forked tail, as well as that great rusty forehead patch. These are the birds that are going to be building their nests on the sides of buildings where the roof meets the wall. They make really cool mud cup nests in colonies, which can be an issue if you're a building owner, but they're only here for a couple of months of the year. They come in the spring, build their nests, they breed, raise their young, and then they move on in the wintertime. Another bird of this family to keep an eye on is a little bit less colorful, a lot less colorful, let's be fair. This is the northern rough-winged swallow. Now, compared to the tree swallow and the barn swallow, it's not very exciting to look at. It's just kind of a dull brownish color. But these are the guys you're going to see a lot if you're by a creek. They're going to be nesting in mud cavities in the banks, which is really cool. How many birds do you know of that are actually kind of nesting underground? And we always like to point out the cool weird things that the birds are doing, and that's one of them for these birds. So all of these birds are aerial hunters. That does mean it's tricky to get a good spot on them, so we're going to go through what unites all of these birds together. So unlike the birds that we've been talking about previously, Anatidae, Odontophoridae, Phaseonidae, our swallows don't have precocial young. They don't come out of the eggs fuzzy and adorable and ready to go. They come out of the eggs looking like that. So that's not cute. They require a ton of parental care. It'll be a couple of days before their eyes open, before they start to grow feathers. So when they come out of the eggs, they look like that. Less exciting, but many of these birds are cavity nesters, or as I said, they are nesting in cups that are quite high up and inaccessible, so they don't need to have babies that are ready to fend for themselves and move around as soon as they're out of the egg. They've got a little bit of leeway where they can take their time growing. This does mean that their parents can lay more eggs. The parents have to do more to raise them, but the trade-offs for the amount of energy put into those eggs is a lot lower than for what we see for things like ducks or geese or swans or pheasants. Now, there are two primary nesting styles here. One of them is the cavity nesters. So these are purple martins. These are the largest of the swallows that we have here. Their populations aren't doing super great for unclear reasons. They're a little bit tricky to actually get to use man-made cavities. We've seen some success with actually using gourds in the mountains here. But their ongoing project of trying to get these birds to nest where they're in a protected area where they're not going to be overrun by starlings or have their habitat destroyed by just people being people. But purple martins will occasionally use nest boxes, as will tree swallows, violet green swallows, whereas things like our barn swallows and our cliff swallows build these little mud daub nests, and they're kind of like cups, and sometimes they'll do a full gourd shape. They'll scoop up this bit by bit mud. They'll scoop up mud in their beaks, and they will cement it together with their saliva. It's a really cool behavior to get to watch because they swoop really low down to the mud, and then carry it back up, and then bit by bit they'll eventually construct a nest. So it takes a lot of effort for them to actually get that nest built. Obviously, it's not the favorite for many building owners if you've got barn or cliff swallows in your neighborhood, but they've got to nest somewhere. So those are our two primary nesting strategies for these birds. When these birds are in flight, it's really important to note that wing structure. They've got long pointed wings. This is a barn swallow, so you can really see that forked tail. The tails of swallows are either going to be forked or they're going to be square. The barn swallow just has incredibly long rectrices. Those are those tail feathers on the outside, so that fork is really, really well defined. In fact, that's the one field mark where you're just like, that's a super forked tail, gotta be a barn swallow. For identification purposes. But they're incredibly acrobatic in the air, and they have to be because they're foraging on flying insects which are much smaller than them and very, very fast. Now, how are they actually managing to grab hold of those insects? Well, you've got to look at their beaks, and they have tiny, tiny beaks. They're very short, very close to the face. They don't have a huge long mandible that's going out and getting in their way. These are two violet green swallows. So we've got one with its beak closed, and you can see it's very tiny. But if you look at the one who is yelling, you can see it opens up very, very wide. So they've got a short, wide beak that they can use to just basically scoop up insects out of the air. Another thing to note with these birds is they've got really tiny, inconsequential feet. It's not quite as bad as the swifts or hummingbirds, but their legs are really, really tiny. They're difficult to see, even here with it facing us. Super, super tiny little feet, which basically disappear into the feathers as soon as they're in midair, which does help reduce their drag. It means they're super maneuverable. They don't have anything that's in the way that's going to ruin their streamlined shape and slow them down, which is really important for these birds. Now, when we're trying to figure out how to tell these birds apart, that's when things get a little bit tricky. You can kind of do a dichotomous key with these birds in this family. The first being, does it have a forked tail or a squared tail? Now, the barn swallow has the most forked tail of all of these ones. If you see one that's just ridiculously exaggerated, barn swallow. But purple martins have a forked tail, violet greens, trees do kind of, but it's far, far more slight. And then you take a look at the cliff swallow, which has a coloration marking that's fairly similar to our barn swallow in that metallic dark blue on the back. It's got a squared off tail. So take a look at the tail first. That'll get you half of the species or so that we have in the area. And then you have to look at the colors. And that's tricky because, as I've mentioned, these birds do not sit still. They're not going to be cooperative for you. And it's important to note that many of these birds that are colorful, they're colorful because they have iridescence, which is not reliable in all lights and at all angles. When we're taking a look at the violet-green swallow, it's got a bright green to purple iridescence on its back, but if you hit the light wrong, it's just going to look like a dull gray. And you might mistake it for another species that doesn't have that iridescence, like the northern rough-winged swallow. So that iridescence should be treated with caution, and it's another thing worth noting, that adult plumage with those bright colors and well-defined lines takes a while to develop. We get these birds during their breeding season. They're building nests, they're doing all sorts of fun activities that we get to see, we get to watch those behaviors. It does mean that we get to see the juveniles too, and juveniles can be confusing, and we will be going through how to tell the juveniles apart. But when we're taking a look at the colors of these birds, as with most birds, it does us a really good favor to pay attention, not necessarily to the specific colors, because as I said, the iridescence makes things a little bit confusing, but the patterns of light and dark that we see on these birds. So the top half, their backs, their heads, those are going to be dark. Their stomachs tend to be pale white, unless of course you're talking about the purple martins, which are uniformly dark. So that does help you if you see a swallow-like bird. It's large, relatively large. Even the purple martin's only weighing like 2 ounces. It's still a small bird, but it is larger than the rest of them that we have here. That's going to be uniformly dark, whereas the others have some really great light versus dark patterns. So when we're looking at, say for example, the tree swallow versus the violet-green swallow, they share habitats. They both have iridescent colors that go towards the green spectrum, which means if you just get a flash of color, it's tricky to tell which species you're looking at. What you want to pay attention to instead is where that white line ends. So for the tree and swallow, they've got a clean line across their face. The white doesn't extend over the eye, as basically where the beak starts, that's where that line of coloration begins. And in comparison, our violet-green swallows, that white goes over the eyes, and in fact, they have white that extends up almost over their rump, which is a really helpful thing to pay attention to, because as they're flying, they're going to be twisting in the air. So odds are pretty good that you're going to be flashed both the stomach side and the back side of these birds while they're moving in flight. When we're looking at, say for example, the northern rough-winged swallow, no iridescence. That's a really big one. But it also doesn't have any white that extends over its sides. And if we take a look at, say for example, our cliff swallow or our barn swallow, we can actually see, so taking a look at our cliff swallow, it's got a bunch of paler patches on its back that shows up. So it's got that pale rump, the nape of its neck is paler, and it's got a bright, almost white forehead. So those are those patches of light that you can catch fairly easily with your binoculars, even if they're moving quickly. You just need a glimpse. You don't need to be able to stare at it long enough to figure out what exactly is this color, but it does give you something to catch with your eye and then be like, okay, well, if it had any white on its rump, I know it can't be a rough-winged swallow. Then we take a look at our barn swallow. It's got a dark rump. It's dark uniformly on the back, but once again, that tail is pretty much unmistakable. Now, going into the juveniles, this is where things get a little bit trickier because, as I mentioned, it takes a while for that adult plumage to develop. So let's take a look at the babies that we're likely to see and go over some field marks that'll help you out. So starting with the violet-green swallow, we can see the start of those curved saddle marks over the rump of the white. They're kind of rough and indistinct right now. Those feathers are still growing in. You can see, both in part because of feather growth and also the angle this bird is at, you can't really get that bright green to purple iridescence that they're actually named for. So that's important to note. But even as this bird is growing in its plumage, it's still in that first basic molt, you can still see the start of the white going over the eye. And that's what you're really going to want to catch. In comparison, the tree swallow, it's got a small amount of white going up the flanks of its rump, but it's not nearly as far extended. And of course, that's that clean line between the white and the dark. It doesn't extend over the eye. Now, the tree swallows, when they're juveniles, don't have that iridescence, that metallic blue-green that's so distinct. And so you can be forgiven for kind of mixing them up with the northern ruffed-winged swallow, particularly when it's a juvenile. But these guys, okay, to be fair, these guys are not only not iridescent, but one of the best juvenile marks for these guys is they've actually got that cinnamon wing bar. So if you take a look at those wings, you can see that there's a warmer coloration. It's a reddish orange on its folded wings, those cinnamon wing bars. You're not going to get a great look at those if they're in flight, but we'll go back to the fact that the northern ruffed-winged swallow is going to have kind of a buffy breast, and it's going to have a uniformly dark back. If we take a look at the face of this bird, it lacks that clean line that even the juvenile tree swallow has. Taking a look at our cliff swallow juveniles, we already have that pale forehead and that pale rump. That's going to be what's really distinctive for these guys. So the tree swallow has those slight crescents on the sides of its rump. The violet-green swallow has those saddle marks that extend a little bit farther, but the cliff swallow has an entirely pale rump, even as a juvenile. So that incomplete plumage is still helping us out, and that's a really good field mark to pay attention for. And then we get our barn swallow juvenile, and I appreciate they've got that forked tail, right? That's super distinctive. And when they're adults, that's helpful. That's incredibly helpful. That can be almost the only field mark you need. It takes the babies a while to grow those feathers in. If you've ever had the joys of having baby birds in your yard or where you can observe them, the tail feathers take a while to grow. So if you've seen like wrens hopping around on the ground, they've got little nubbin tails. Same holds true for the barn swallows. So they're going to look like they have a more squared tail, but they're barn swallows, not cliff swallows, so they're not going to have that pale rump. So even with the very similar dark blue iridescence that the cliffs and the barns share, that rump coloration is really, really helpful. So we didn't touch on the purple martin juveniles. They are up here. And the reason for that is while we do technically have breeding numbers here in Santa Clara County, they are very, very small in number. You're unlikely to see them. And to be frank, the size difference is noticeable for these ones. Unlike the other swallows, they're not going to have a distinctly pale underside. They'll have spotting because their adult feathers are still growing in, but it won't be that clean, well-defined. There's a dark side and a light side to this bird. It'll be more of just a uniform modeling. So, hopefully, that helps you out with your swallow ID. We've got a ton out here. If you go to pretty much any park that has water or open space in it, and that water can be anything from like a percolation pond, a reservoir, a creek running through it, that way you're a little bit more set up for identifying these dudes. Although I do strongly encourage, if you're starting off, bring your field guide with you. You'll still want to reference it. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday and a happy 4th this weekend, folks, and I'll see you all next week.